Welcome to our webinar today, which is focused on the evolution of public affairs from an EU perspective. I'm Jodie Emerson and I'm the Managing Director for the UK and Europe at Hanson Search. And we're delighted to be joined this morning by a fantastic panel who we'll introduce you to in just a moment. But first, I just wanted to go through a couple of quick housekeeping points. So we'd like the session today to be as interactive as possible. So please do use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens to ask questions at any point throughout the session. We'll try and sort of discuss some of them as part of our key discussion, but we've also got some specific time towards the end of the session that we'll answer those questions too, and we'll get through as many of those as we possibly can. Secondly, this is a recorded webinar, so following the session, we will send out the link to all of you, and it will also be available on our website in a few days' time. For those of you that don't know Hanson Search, we're a specialist headhunting business that focus on marketing and communications services, and we've been recruiting into the public affairs market for around 15 years now. So I'll hand over now to our chair this morning, my colleague Barbara Ozanon, who leads our European practice, and she will introduce our panel to you.
Thank you, Janie, and welcome everyone to this webinar where we will be exploring the evolving role of public affairs. So as an international recruiter, I've had many discussions about the topic from different angles across different markets, discussing the trends that impact and shape the public affairs function. And as you know, public affairs is the interface between the company and the society at large. So it is automatically and directly impacted by its environment, whether it's technological, economic, social, political. So the approach to public affairs and to public policy has changed over decades. So we decided to gather a diverse panel of experts to talk to us about this topic, to give us their perspective, their insight, and their point of view. So I'm very pleased today to welcome our fantastic speakers. We have today Markus Weidling, who is partner at Interel in its Berlin office. We also have Andras, who is the Managing Director of the Public Affairs Council in their European office in Brussels. We also have Piero Crivellaro, who has recently joined Amazon as Head of Public Policy in Italy. And finally, we have Louise Harvey, who is the non-executive chair of the FTI Consulting Strategic Communication practice in Brussels, and who kindly stepped in as Julia Harrison couldn't make it today. So thank you all for being here. I would like to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself very briefly. So Markus, can you start maybe?
Thank you, Barbara. Sure. Sunny greetings from Berlin. Yes, I would describe myself probably a little bit like a political vagabond. I started my professional career as political correspondent for our public TV broadcasters, then became chief spokesperson of one of our federal ministries, and then was honored to serve as German diplomat to the United Nations in New York. And since 10 years, I'm now in the public affairs business, since 7 years with Interel. So I'm really excited to be on this panel, especially on a day like this. It keeps me away from watching CNN the entire day today. It's nerve-wracking what's happening there in the US. So Barbara, thank you for having me.
Thank you, Markus. Andras, do you want to continue? Present yourself.
Absolutely, and I can just second Markus' opinion that I think we're all hooked to our Twitter feeds and cable news and whatnot. But hopefully the discussion will be worth your time. My name is Andras. I'm based in Brussels, as you mentioned. I'm originally Hungarian, quite a few years now, also Belgian. And I have background in European affairs and for quite a few years now in strategic communications. And I'm heading the Public Affairs Council in Brussels since 2013. So we're the largest non-political, non-partisan organization dealing with public affairs with over 700 members in the US and in Europe. And we're basically observing anything and everything related to public affairs without representing our members. So we try to take that practical and one step approach and analyze what's going on. So hopefully that perspective will bring more value to the discussion.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Piero, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now working for Amazon, as everybody knows, but I have, a strong experience on public policy, 20 years experience, both in-house and consultancy, and working for trade associations. I work both at national level, so I have a lot of experience in lobbying and interacting with stakeholders in several European countries, but also in Brussels, because I lived in Brussels in the past. In the last years, I've also become more active as a business angel, and this is something that I really like from a personal point of view.
Thank you very much, Piero. Louise, do you want to talk about you?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm the non-executive chair of FTI Consulting based in Brussels. I've been in Brussels for over 30 years now. Actually, I'm one of the co-founders of FTI's business in Brussels, which was founded about 17, 18 years ago now. And previously to that, I was working for other communications consultancies, not only in Brussels, but also in the Netherlands and in London. And prior to that, I had 13 years as a diplomat, as a British diplomat, working in the Far East, Africa, and in Europe. I currently really focus on a non-executive directorship portfolio, which includes non-executive roles both in Brussels and in the UK.
Okay, brilliant, very clear. Thank you, Louise. Well, let's start the discussion, and I would like to start with you, Markus. And stepping right into the topic, could you share with us your view on how has the role of public affairs changed?
Right. Yes, indeed, it has changed. I would say over 10, 15 years. It is a slow change, what we're observing, more like an evolution, not really a dramatic change. But what we do observe is we are moving away from standalone lobbying campaigns focusing on a single issue to more long-term relationship building and long-term stakeholder engagement. From our perspective at Interel, we strongly believe in a world with increased political risk, institutional fragmentation, regulatory uncertainties, all what's happening in the US at the moment. Public affairs is an increasingly important strategic discipline and management function at the core of a company. To understand what's going on out there politically in the respective markets does not only mean to gain a competitive advantage for a company, but very often it means to protect your business case all the way up to the company's survival. And thus, more than ever, we believe companies need to anticipate and develop strategies to address these critical beyond market forces, from legislation and regulation to activism, campaigning, and media. And what we have been observing in the market is just recently backed by a McKinsey global survey on external engagement. And here the findings are saying that 60% of the respondents said that long-term stakeholder engagement is a key priority to their CEOs, one of the top 3 priorities for their CEOs. So we are moving away from the old style lobbying towards long-term engagement.
Thank you, Mark.
Barbara, can I just perhaps jump in there and support what Markus has said? I mean, you kindly said that we could make this as interactive as possible. And I just wanted to say that we actually had a resilience barometer survey earlier in the year of G20 large company business leaders. And what was interesting, one of the things that was interesting that came out of that was that 3 of the top C-suite concerns had to do with public affairs work. And those 3 top concerns were this is very topical today, the disputed, potentially disputed US presidential election results, the implosion of US-China relationship, and a UK-EU trade deal or no deal post-Brexit. And I think that really just sort of underlines what Markus has just said.
But also, if I can step in as well on this, I think that, irrespectively of the themes that are relevant for the CEOs, I think that probably completely changed the way we work and interact with policymakers. I think that 10 years ago, basically the interaction was only reactive. So there is a problem, we need to interact and solve the problems. So this was the way of working. Nowadays is more proactive, the job. So the way that I'm seeing, not only where I'm working now, but also in the past, we are trying to proactively engaging policymakers to become, as I would say, trusted advisor of governments. And we move from the ask, so the interaction was basically, you government, please do this, do that for us, on what we can do for you, how we can help you to achieve your results. Because at the end of the day, to maintain, as Markus was saying, a long-term interaction, a long-term engagement, is important that you gain trust, not only as a professional, but also as a company. And to do so, you need absolutely to have a proactive approach and understand what the government is looking for, what the type of helps that needs, not only, of course, at national level, but also the European level. So also the way we work, I think that in the past probably 10 years has completely changed. The other thing, if I may add on this, is the role of third parties. I think that more and more as a public affairs, we work and interact and engage with third parties, not only to support our initiatives, but also because we believe that they have more strength towards government. So I think that these are the two main changes that we have seen in the past years, probably as in public policy.
Yeah, thank you, Piero. You're completely right. And I believe also that maybe Andras, you had a strong opinion on how also technology nowadays have bring changes on how do you do your public affair and public policy work.
Absolutely. This is completely in line with what we heard so far. So public affairs becoming a more strategic function, becoming more of a support role. And at the same time, one of the key changes in public affairs is really the role of technology. It used to be, when we talk about the term digital advocacy, which is not a term that had existed 5 or 8 years ago, it's become a completely different scope. So it's not only doing a campaign on social media, it's become about political intelligence. So gathering far more information, getting a far broader view of the social, technological, political and legislative changes happening out there using software to do that. It's also impacted how internal coordination, communication within companies happen. So I'm sure Piero can tell us stories, and Louise certainly, and Markus, through your clients, of how they coordinate their work across different jurisdictions using centralized platforms to share information about meetings with government officials, meetings with key stakeholders, and then coordinating campaigns. And then the biggest leap is already happening and will be even more is the predictive value, seeing what is coming next, anticipating it, and not just sort of relying on your gut feeling and political insights, but using data to predict, project what is coming up.
Absolutely. Louise, do you have anything to add on this, perhaps?
This whole discussion around data, I think, is very topical, and certainly it's important. And I think one of our findings amongst the research that we've done is that data analytics and evidence is key, and measurement and sort of tracking, and just as sort of Andras was just saying. However, I think it's really important, and I would say this particularly for sort of younger members of the audience, perhaps, who are listening. Not to lose sight of the importance of personal connections and personal relationships. And I'm not talking about sort of little black books or anything like that, but what makes the world go round, what makes business go round? It's all to do with personal connections. And I think one of the challenges that we have, particularly in this coronavirus time, is how to maintain those connections, because sometimes policies are gleams in people's eyes. It's not to be found on the internet, or it's not something that you can necessarily pursue through data. So yes, I agree, but somehow we have to keep alive that whole sort of personal relationship in public affairs, because I think it'll continue to be key. And in a way, I think you can take a cue from politicians. I mean, there's a reason why President Macron, for example, went to Brussels recently, to speak to Mrs. von der Leyen. Because you miss something if you're doing everything in a remote way, or if you're doing something just using technology.
If I may just come back to it for a second. I completely agree with Louise. So it's not an either-or question of technology or personal relations and contact. It's technology-aided human contact. Perhaps that's the term, where you come with data and insights, and what that commissioner or member of parliament or government official has said in public, what they shared on social media. You come armed with a lot of information, but indeed looking into their eyes makes all the difference. And I'm sure we'll come back to the COVID times lobbying, and having Zoom calls is definitely not the same as sharing a coffee with a person face to face. But well, that's another conversation, how effective that is and how COVID has changed the way we do lobbying. But just to second your point, in terms of technology plus human context will remain the key elements of the job.
Well, I quickly like to echo what has been said with another perspective. It's not only the context, but also, the political analytical competence. What I mean is, we've been pursuing the question of data analytics for public affairs work since years. And it all comes back to people behind the machines doing the data analytics to put in the right questions and to read the data correctly, which comes out there. So it's not only context, but also, human brain we still need to analyze the political environment and political trends and sentiments.
So in relation to this adding a bit and going back on how our role has changed. Data, as Andras was saying, are relevant. I think that nowadays is becoming even more relevant the monitoring on social media activities of policymaker. I think that when I started the job, basically the monitoring activity was only related to the development of the regulations and probably media, but we are talking about the traditional media. Nowadays, I think that if you want to have a proper interactions with your stakeholders, with the people that you need to influence, I would say at the end of the day, I think that the social monitoring part is even more relevant than traditional media at the end of the day, because nowadays all policymakers and let's say, and third parties are talking more on social medias than on traditional media. So the data part is relevant. The data part is key to have a proper interaction and let's say, and a structured interactions. But I also think that the social media part is becoming more relevant, not only for the interaction, but also for the campaign that all of us are doing on a daily basis.
Absolutely, you're right, and that reminds me when I had the discussion with Markus about what has changed in public affairs and PR, and his answer was, well, the social aspect of it, the digital marketing has bring a whole new area, opportunities for your work. Okay, actually, Markus, I remember when we were talking about public affairs from a global approach. you were mentioning the differences that we, like the differences between our European approach and the American approach. Is there anything here that you think we could learn from our neighbors, American neighbors?
Well, from our perspective, my perspective, it is what I described in my first answer. You know, this long-term development to relationship building is far more advanced with American companies, at least with the companies we're working with. You know, and what we see there, public affairs being a central management function, it's still a pretty long way to see the same level of public affairs engagement of senior management here in Germany. So yes, so short answer, the evolution we were talking about earlier is coming from the US, and at least here in Germany, you know, there is a lot to learn from there.
Okay. Maybe Louise, would you like to share with us maybe what would be your advice to CEOs and business leaders listening to us today on how they could improve or how they can structure efficiently their public affairs function, and what is their key role in it, in its success?
Yeah. Good question. I think, you know, every company is different. I don't think that there's sort of a template that you can say this is how you should do it, because it has to sort of follow, you know, how a company is structured and run. But having said that, I mean, one observation is, and I've often been quite surprised by this when sort of being able to look inside companies when one's worked for them as a consultancy, is how unjoined up sometimes they can be internally. So that quite often, and I think one of the things, you know, one of the areas that's quite interesting to discuss is how public affairs works with strategic communications and sort of the PR side of the business. And one of the things that I've been struck by is how sometimes companies have very pillarized sort of functions, and indeed there can quite often be a tension in between, you know, between public affairs and public relations professionals within within a company in-house, and that absolutely needs to be joined up, and particularly companies that are in a crisis. You can't have some sort of internal warfare going on as to what the different communications disciplines are pursuing. Public relations, we've always had a large proportion of our team, a strategic communications specialist, as opposed to sort of policy wonk people, and have worked that jointly. And I think that that's critical. So if there's one thing I would say to companies to do, it would be to make sure that that was joined up. And it also needs to be joined up in a sort of a global way as well, across geographies. So it's no good at just working like satisfactorily at head office. It needs to work in all the jurisdictions that matter to you as a business.
Thank you. Anyone?
If I may add, I agree 100%. Plus, you know, what makes it even more difficult, the internal warfare, is when the legal units are involved. Then, you know, anything gets a lot more complicated. You know, you have basically 3 pillars: PA, PR, and the legal team not working together, and then campaigns can really go astray. And here I would also say, you know, join forces internally.
But I also think that talking about what Louise just said, with I totally agree. It's I mean, 2 things here. It really depends on the company, as Louise said. I mean, in some company, public policy, public affairs is part of the legal team. In other company, public policy, public affairs is part of the communication team. So it depends also on the culture and the type of the company. Honestly, I don't have any preference. I think that public policy has to work both with legal and corporate communication, because it's crucial. I mean, if we need to sell a product that is probably an amendment or another proposal probably is drafted by legal, and on the other end, we need to work with the communication, because all our public affairs campaign has nowadays been, I mean, we have the need of being supported by the communication. So on this, to be honest, I don't have a preference, but I think that our communication and legal are our allies for sure. Another aspect that I find, in my opinion, especially in the last years, really important is also the interaction with business. I mean, don't forget that public policy is a supported function for business. And what I'm saying is that not only in defending the business, but also to support the business to find new business opportunity. For instance, legislative changes are done not only, as I said, to protect what companies are already doing, but legislative changes can also bring more business for the company that we work with. So I understand the importance of legals. I understand the importance of talking with communication, but at the end of the day, sorry guys, but our salary is paid by the revenues that our salespeople are making. So if public policy can support the expansion of the business through legislative changes or having less pressures from regulatory changes, I think that is much more relevant to my personal opinion and especially my experience.
May I just add some reflections on that? And I think it's a very interesting topics are coming up. One thing to highlight perhaps is the importance of public affairs being plugged in high enough to the senior management. So it needs to be a very high level and strategic function, like many of you said at the beginning, that whether to an executive committee member or board member or a VP, but it has to be represented at that level because it's increasingly acknowledged as critical to the business. The other part is the evergreen question of measuring the value or the impact of public affairs. I realize that the sun is really pointing at me. I'll try to change the image in a second. So public affairs really, the measurement, the KPIs is a topic. We also organize roundtables and white papers and different formats on this, of how to measure it. And whether it's fighting off harmful legislation, harmful as in with a severe business impact, but perhaps even increasingly finding sources of revenue through regulation or through government funds. And I think in the context of COVID and stimulus measures, all of this becomes really important of how you in the public affairs function can tap into those resources through the right political and other channels. So that's pretty much it. Let me just adjust my image in a second.
No worries. Did you have anything to add on this, or?
Maybe one sentence to what Piero said. Of course, you know, with all what we are doing, we need to be linked to the business case of the company. I mean, you know, it's not only the salary is what is paid out of that, but also our budgets as consultancy. So and that is something what public affairs consultancy went through too over the last years. You know, trying to grasp even stronger the business case and to understand, you know, where the core business of the company is and how to link public affairs to not only protecting the business case, but maybe even in best cases, developing the best business case. Here in Germany, for example, you know, as you know, we are going through an energy transition away from nuclear. Now the next phase into away from coal into a hydrogen powered economy. So here, business cases and public affairs and knowing what the legislation and regulation and also public funding is going to do in the next month, years to come is very, very important, and it is paying into business development for our clients. That's for sure.
Absolutely. I know that, Piero, you had a very good example on this.
That I cannot share.
A company in the mobility.
Okay. No, I think that I mean, depends where you are in the lobbying activity. I think that once we discuss, you can be, let's say the driver or the follower. I think that the major example here is in the mobility area. Everybody knows Uber. Everybody knows the approach that they had when they start campaigning in Europe. And everybody knows the advantage that in this case the follower had compared to the Uber case. So I think that companies, especially new businesses, they really need to understand and discuss deeply the strategy instead of just wanting what they want, because the risk is that instead of driving the change, basically they are helping their competitor to drive the change. So Uber is a case, but everybody knows about Uber. There are other cases similar to this one. I would like to echo what Markus said before. I mean, this is why public policy is really important. That is part of the management team, and as being I mean, we need to be consultant, I would say, on a regular basis, because we know how the political environment is functioning, and is working, and is moving, and I would say also shaking sometimes, especially nowadays in this new situation.
Thank you. Okay, great. I can see we have lots of questions from the audience. So I would like to have one last questions for you, the panel, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A session. So once again, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A sections that you have on your screen. My last question would be for Louise, and would be around diversity in the industry. It has been improvement, but I think it's fair to say that it's still a work in progress. So Louise, could you share with us what improvements you've seen and explain to us what would be the benefit to diversity within the industry?
Yes. I think I'd start off by saying we as a business always believed that diversity was key to success. And when we set up our business originally, our objective was to hire people from different backgrounds, different walks of life, different cultures. And now in our team of 100, we've got 27 different nationalities working in the Brussels office. And I think that it speaks for itself. I think that there is clearly now more focus on the importance of diversity, and that's sort of gone into overdrive as a result of developments on Black Lives Matter this year. But as you said, a lot more needs to be done. There is every sign that, you know, the consultancy world is looking at this seriously and trying to address the challenges in recruiting and retaining people from different backgrounds. And there's every sign as well that the corporate world is looking at this seriously. I'm optimistic, therefore, that we will continue to see change and improvement as far as diversity in the industry is concerned.
If I may add, it is for us also a very, very relevant issue and aspect, and the Brussels team is doing fairly well at Interel. They have a diversity charter, and I don't know the exact numbers of how many different nations, but it's all, at least the entire Europe is somehow represented. But in Berlin, I have a huge issue of getting people who are applying from different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. You know, if I take the last 3 years, I probably had no one really from south of Europe. We had a few from Eastern Europe, no one from overseas. I believe it is also a language issue here in Germany probably, but it is really hard to overcome this, and we need to work really smartly on solutions on this. We're going to communities with our job postings, but yes, so it's still a long way. Public affairs in Germany is still not really one of the key diversity drivers, unfortunately.
I think just to follow on from that as well, it's important not just to think about racial diversity, but it's important to think about LGBTQI, for example, for people with disability as well. I mean, the whole basket, if you like, of diversity needs to be addressed by the industry.
Absolutely.
I wanted to add perhaps two meanings or two ways of looking at diversity. I think the first one is what we are discussing right now is the diversity of the lobbying, of the advocacy profession, which I think there's still quite some way to go, and we heard some good trends. But in terms of Brussels and EU affairs and the lobby or advocacy community, if you will, it's still a long way to go where it probably should be in terms of how diverse it is based on all these many metrics. And Politico has been pretty critical of certain trends, and they ran some articles, but I think reality is a little better than how it's depicted, but is still a way to go. The other, it's perhaps an even bigger question, is how companies should embrace these sort of social trends and the pressure on them, and whether companies should respond to these needs to engage on large social trends and discussions, and whether should they take a stance on that. And perhaps when it comes to diversity, I think it's a pretty no-brainer to say, yes, they have to integrate that into their business for very good business reasons, if nothing else. But in terms of speaking up on social issues, obviously it's a far broader question, whether it's a company's role or not to talk about Black Lives Matter, or absolutely not, because they are a shoemaker and that's what they need to focus on. Whereas other companies have in their DNA that sort of social activist trend. If you just think about Ben & Jerry's famously, but there are many others that might think, okay, we need to speak up on these issues. Whereas other companies say, well, we just do our business, we can have our opinions and we can sign petitions, but it's really not our task to deal with social questions. And again, this latter topic is a far broader question. Might be interesting to discuss whether or not, or we can go to the Q&A, but the corporate, being a corporate citizen, what does it mean today in the age of very strong public pressure on social questions?
We have our next webinar, maybe. Thank you. Yeah, should we pass now? I'll hand over to the Q&A session.
Yes, great. Well, it actually brings us on really nicely to one of the questions. We've had lots coming through, so I will try and get through as many as possible. But sort of following on from your point, Andreas, about the sort of public affairs strategies and the fact that now there is an expectation for companies to be committed to society and having a positive impact. How do you think that sort of changes the way that you need to deliver and advise when you're coming to public affairs and sort of talking to companies? Does that change it? And if so, what are those changes?
Would that be addressed to me or
yes,
someone else?
Please, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I'll get that question back. I think it really largely depends on which sector a company is in and which kind of products or services they do. So, Piero, you can certainly tell us about Amazon helping buyers to donate to various charities of their choice by simply purchasing certain products or looking. So consumer-facing brands, I believe, are far more exposed to this sort of pressure. So they probably need to have a certain policy or at least a certain position on how they want to approach it. If you're a B2B brand, if you're a chemicals company or a car parts manufacturer, probably there's no real pressure from the outside to take a stance. Now, whether the CEO is truly committed to this and it ultimately helps the business, you think of Unilever, and Paul Polman at the time was famously very activist minded, if you will, and very much thinking about sustainability, and it paid off. You know, it brought the company great fortunes. So whether it's coming from an external pressure or from an internal management side, I think these are all factors you need to consider from one industry to another and make a decision accordingly.
Great, thank you. Would anyone else like to add to that one?
I'm happy to add. I think the whole sort of ESG debate is very live at the moment. And again, referring back to our resilience barometer, one of the things that came out of that was that 4 out of 5 global businesses surveyed agreed that they're focusing particularly on the social, on the S pillar of ESG, and this is preoccupying some of them. I think that you see you know, behaviors from organizations which haven't traditionally been bothered about this beginning to sort of drive change in companies. You know, investors, fund managers, for example, pursuing ESG policies, having representatives sitting on boards, which is helping to drive this agenda. And companies are paying attention. They have to pay attention. And therefore, that has a knock-on effect for the sort of advice as well that that we're giving clients. It's a very live topic at the moment, and rightly.
Well, I would like to add one aspect. What we see in the US, what we see across Europe is a strong disconnect between the people out there, the voters, and the political establishment, or what we call in Berlin, the Berlin bubble. And now no one really understands what's going on. And we as public affairs professional, and also public affairs professional in companies, are part of this bubble. And all this radicalization and fragmentation in politics, in the party landscape, again, what we see in the US at the moment, is linked to not understanding what is happening in the Berlin bubble, in the Brussels bubble, in the Washington bubble, what allies are doing. And here is our responsibility as public affairs professionals, being part of this bubble, being member of this bubble, to make it more transparent, to dissolve this disconnect we are observing now. And this is very important in our daily work as consultants, consulting companies, but also, in our private life, we need to make our work more transparent and explain what people, what is happening, what companies are doing with politics and vice versa. And here, we really need to follow a strong corporate political responsibility. And this is something we need to work on in the future. Really very important.
In this respect, Jenny, and the rest, I think that if we go back to the first question, how the public policy role has changed compared to the last year, I think that looking into the ESG or corporate social responsibility activity, this is another big change that happened in our job, because I mean, I'm thinking of what I'm doing now, but also my previous company that I was working at Massacre. I think that, I mean, during a meeting, basically the ESG activities or corporate social responsibility activity were becoming more and more part of your narrative. So in the sense that once you interact or engage with a policymaker, yes, you need to, normally you interact in relation to a specific need or a specific presentation of a report or something like this. But at the beginning or at the end of this meeting, there are always reference to the other programs related to environment, to sustainability, to social responsibility, and so on. So I think that these aspects are also becoming more and more part of our narrative. And I've read recently a study on corporate social responsibility that basically was saying basically the results of this study, of this very interesting study, in my opinion, were saying that more the company are active on the corporate social responsibility activity, more are effective in the lobbying campaign. And this was not just a qualitative study, but was a quantitative study. So this made me reflect a lot on how this part is becoming more and more relevant, not just to show off and saying multinational companies are doing this and that, but also is becoming also more relevant and let's say, and supporting our activity as well.
Great, thank you all. And yes, completely agree that it's certainly something that is top of the agenda at the moment. Another question that's come through, and I'll start with you, Louise, on this one, if that's okay, was how you would sort of concretely advise to maintain the interpersonal relationships during times of COVID. You mentioned that that's sort of more difficult at the moment for obvious reasons. Do you have any sort of examples or pieces of advice that you could give our audience?
Well, I mean, I think there's some very old-fashioned ways of doing this, but which people don't do as much these days as perhaps they used to, and that is just pick up the telephone, you know, to some people. I think, you know, I think there is a difference between people you know or people you've had contact with in comparison with making new friends, and I think, you know, making those new contacts is always more challenging, but particularly in these times. But whereas people you know, you're not going to be able to bump into somebody to have a coffee or something like that, but there's no reason why you can't sort of email somebody and say, would they have time for a telephone call? Or, you know, some of my clients and some of my contacts, I send little WhatsApps to sometimes have a sort of a quick ad hoc conversation with them on a WhatsApp video or something like that. But you have to keep, I think you just have to keep doing it, and you have to sort of be brave about it and not just leave it all to you know, sending emails or more you know, Zoom. It would tend to be a more sort of formal type arrangement. So I would try and keep it as informal as possible. And people are still answering their telephones, and they're still, you know, still want to chat, and they still want to sort of pass the time of day. And I think probably the subject matter, I always, you know, we're all facing challenges, right? So people want to chat sometimes about the difficulty of having their kids at home or their pets or whatever it happens to be. I think we just need to bring that sort of human, that human feel into the contacts, and not just sit at home isolated. So there's something to be said perhaps for having sort of setting yourself some targets to make sort of informal contact with people without wanting anything, you know, just to maintain connections.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Markus. Sorry, please.
I just wanted to say they do appreciate it. You know, during our lockdown times in April and May, people were really happy when they got a call, and during that time, you know, it paid off. Basically, to my earlier point, you know, be prepared. As long as you have long-term relationship, it is easy to pick up the phone, and then you do get the information. It doesn't have the same impact as meeting someone, and sometimes even more, because to Louise's points, they you know, they like to talk on the phone and chat a little bit along on other things as well.
There's one thing just to sort of add as well, is I think you know, companies, and this includes consultancies as well as big corporates, there's sort of anxiety, isn't there, about keeping in touch with teams and keeping in touch with colleagues as well. And there's a tendency, therefore, to sort of have online social stuff, you know, for the whole team. You know, it could be cocktails or whatever. But I think sometimes that can just be adding to the load, right? Because young people particularly, I have a 26-year-old daughter, and I sort of see, you know, she's invited to join a cocktail or something like that, and it just feels like an extension of the working day. You know, when you've been on your computer all day and you've been on Zoom and you haven't, the Zoom meetings, and you haven't been able to get out and what have you, do you want to have another hour or an hour and a half having cocktails with colleagues? Probably not. But, you know, very nice to, you know, have an informal contact with somebody in the organization, maybe not necessarily a peer, maybe somebody quite senior who just picks up the telephone and says, hiya, how are you doing? How are you feeling? You know, that sort of conversation. So I don't think it's just sort of with clients or with business contacts, but it's also to do with the internal team.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. From my perspective, what I'm doing, I'm seeing the questions on the chat, and I mean, it goes without saying that nowadays, as public policy, we are benefiting on the work that we have done in the past years. So we are taking profit, and we are still gaining a lot from the relations and the network that we built in the last year. What I'm trying to do basically is a very simple thing every day, as probably Louise said. I mean, to have a call at the end of the day, around just before dinner, to call a person that I was working with, just to say, hey, how is going the thing? Everything is okay. Long time that we don't speak, or I know that we spoke yesterday about this, but I wanted to know more about how is going the other things. So it's just, I mean, easy. One call per day. I mean, I know that the day is really busy, but if you try to keep one, I mean, one simple rule, I would say, to have just one call every day, to keep this type of interaction, this more informal interaction, social interaction that we had before, I think that you are able to keep your very good relation, your informal relations. Is something very simple. Sometimes, I mean, you don't need to think that is a half an hour call. Sometimes it's just 5-minute call. But I mean, this pays off more than a Zoom meeting, as you perfectly know about this.
I wanted to add perhaps one thing, again, to echo everything that's been said. I think that, and it's a little bit related to the organizer's business of people business and hiring and search, where you certainly were looking at candidates, whether junior or senior positions, who had the government affairs knowledge, so knowing the processes and the systems. I presume you were looking at those who had this diplomatic skills and that sort of skill set. But perhaps even increasingly, it's even more important to have the people skills, the communication skills, and empathy becoming a really important thing. So ultimately, as a lobbyist or as an interest representative or a public affairs specialist, you want to persuade. And to do that through these very impersonal channels, like staring at a screen, you're basically left with your clear communication abilities. You're left with empathizing with a person whose kids are screaming in the back and they need to finish some important legislative piece. You need to understand them on a human level, which of course is not only nice, but it's also effective in reaching your goals in that interaction. So I think that skill set is often not talked about enough, even though it's become really, really important.
Brilliant. Some very helpful tips and advice there, I think. So I think we've got time for one more quick question, and a couple of our questions sort of touch on this. So talking about the sort of ROI of the investment in public affairs, and I know it's something that we hear that can be a frustration of public affairs professionals. How can they sort of prove their worth? So do you have any thoughts about, you know, the best ways to kind of measure that return on the investment for the firms? And Piero, if I can come to you first on that one.
This is one of the most difficult thing in public affairs, to be honest. I always struggle especially in the past. I'm working for a company that is data driven and is a bit easier. In any case, I think that it is important to set, some key milestones on this when you structure a public policy campaign. So KPIs are important, and more quantitative KPI than qualitative KPI are better understood from business that they think with numbers and less with quantitative. So I'm not thinking about having 20,000. I mean, if you said that the KPI is, I don't know, 20 tweets or something like this, I think that at the end of the day is not an achievement, to be honest. It's important, but it's not an achievement. If you set KPIs like, this campaign will help to increase the, I don't know, revenues in this region or in this country by 10%, 15% or something like this, this has become more relevant, and also it makes your role more relevant for business. As I said before, the interaction with legal and corporate communication is important. But if you want to have budget, as Markus was saying, if you want to have more people to address, let's say, your activities and to support your activity, you need really to bring economic value to business at the end of the day. So, in my opinion, the advice that I can make in relation to this is that try in your campaigns to set more quantitative KPIs than qualitative KPIs, because at the end, this is what matters the most and what is, easily also understood from business.
We actually have a free report on measuring the value of public affairs. So that should be available somewhere on our website on pac.org, and you can download that, and it's got a couple of case studies and examples exactly on that, of how companies use input metrics, output metrics, and outcome metrics, or impact metrics, as a matter.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're out of time for our session today. So I'd just like to extend a very big thank you to all of our panelists who joined us and for providing such fascinating insight on this topic. Obviously, lots still to talk through. And as I mentioned, the session has been recorded, so will be sent to all of you and also available on our website in a couple of days' time. Our next webinar is actually on a topic that's come up again today that we can explore in a little more detail, and it'll be held on the 24th of November, and we'll be joined by a panel to discuss how the pandemic has highlighted ESG considerations for businesses and trends that are arising and accelerating because of this. So I do hope that some of you can join us again then. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.